This is episode 83. You have no idea, so you can assume? Yep. Okay, because you did know this. I know, so you can assume? Yep. Okay. Because you know this, eventually. I know, why? You can assume? Yep. Because I didn't know this. Of course. I know, why? If I could assume, eventually. I know. If I could assume, Julie. I know, why? Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Of course, you have no idea. So you can assume? Yep. Yeah? Of course, you have no idea. For some reasons, eventually. Of course. If I could assume, Julie. I know, why? So you can assume? Yep. If I could assume, Julie. Of course, you have no idea. If I could assume, eventually. So, you didn't notice? Nope. Right, of course. You have no idea. Right, did I realize that eventually? Yep. Okay, because I said so? Right, of course. You have no idea. I know. For some reasons, eventually. You're not sure you realize that? Yep. Right, of course. You have no idea. I know, for some reasons. Well, you can assume? Yep. Okay. Because I didn't notice. I know, right? So you can assume? Yeah. Of course. You have no idea. If I could assume, Julie? Yeah. Of course. If I could assume, Julie? Because I didn't know this. Yeah? Of course. If I could assume, Julie? Yeah? Of course. If I could assume, Julie? Yeah? I know, why? So, if you could assume, okay. So, you didn't know this? Yeah, okay. If I could assume, Julie? Yeah? Of course, you have no idea. So, you could assume? Yep, because we know this. Of course, you have no idea. I know, why? So, you could assume? Yep. Okay, because you didn't know this. Yeah? Of course. So, you could assume, Julie? Yeah, yep. Right, of course. You have no idea. I know, so you assume? Yep, yeah, of course. If I assume originally, yeah, of course, you have no idea. I know, for some reasons, eventually, you have no idea. I know, if I assume originally, yep, because you didn't notice? Nope, because I didn't notice. Of course. You have no idea. For some reasons. I know, so you assume? Yep. Okay. Because you didn't know this, so you can assume. I know, right? Because you didn't know this, Eve, you can assume. I know, so you can assume usually. Yep, because you didn't know this. I know, right? Yeah, of course. You have no idea. I know, for some reasons. I know, right? So you can assume. Of course. Yeah, I know, right? So, you can assume? Yeah, okay, yeah. Because I didn't know this. If I assume, usually. Yeah, I know, right? If I assume, usually. I know, you have no idea. Of course. If I assume, usually. I know, right? So, you assume? Yep. Meow. I know, right? So, you assume? Yeah. Of course. You have no idea. I know, so you assume? Yep. Okay, yeah. Because you didn't know this? Nope. Right, of course. You have no idea. I know, right? So, you assume? Yep. Okay, because you didn't know this. I know, right? If I assume, usually. Of course. You have no idea. Yeah, I know, right? If I assume, usually. I have no idea. Of course. Yeah, I know, right? So, you assume? Of course. Yeah, I know, right? You have no idea. Of course. I know, so you assume? Yeah, okay. So, you didn't know this? Nope. Yeah, of course. You have no idea. Oh, if I assume, usually. Yeah, yeah.